Good evening and welcome to the Money Programme. Tonight on the Money Programme, we're going to look at money. Lots of it, on film and in the studio. Some of it in nice piles, others in lovely clanky bits of loose change. Some of it neatly counted into fat little hundreds, delicate fivers stuffed into bulging wallets, nice, crisp, clean checks, pert pieces of copper coinage thrust deep into trouser pockets, romantic foreign money rolling against the thigh with rough familiarity, beautiful wayward curly-cued banknotes, filigree copper grating cheek by jowl with tumbling hexagonal milled edges, rubbing gently against the terse leather of beautifully balanced bank books. But I love money.
Hey everyone, this is Miscellaneous again, and this is a discussion of Santos' bank corporate loan pricing following the subprime mortgage crisis. Here are the main discussion points that I'm going to touch upon. There's the history of the subprime mortgage crisis, the thesis, data, and variables that Santos used, the type of banks that Santos refers to, the post-crisis liquidity, the types of borrowers, the loan size, banks' profits, the interest rate benchmark used, LIBOR versus the Fed funds rate, and then finally referring back to credit rationing and microfinance. The roots of the crisis go back to the aftermath of the internet bubble correction of 2000 and the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. In their wake, to prevent a deepening recession, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to historic lows, in mid-2003 to 1%. This meant that holding money in a bank or in treasury bills was expensive, whereas getting a loan was very cheap. It was especially cheap to get a housing loan, and the federal government, starting with the Clinton administration, had been pushing aggressively for the extension of home loans to as many people as possible. Innovators at the large investment banks figured out a way to turn all of these new mortgages, both good mortgages and bad mortgages, into bonds and then sell these off. The assets securing the bonds were the houses, which got more and more valuable every month. Parts of California and Florida in particular were in the midst of a building frenzy. Speculators were buying unbuilt property in Florida from developers, then selling it online to other buyers, all before ground had even been broken for the building. The country swarmed with an army of mortgage brokers selling mortgages to whomever they could find, and developers putting up the houses that these mortgages had bought. In mid-2005, in response to the housing market, median home prices in the United States finally began to decline. This was the beginning of the crisis, but it first hit the news in July of 2007 when two Bear Stearns hedge funds that had invested heavily in mortgage-backed securities went under. At this point, two separate but related problems became visible. The first was that holders of subprime mortgages, which were mortgages that were extended to people with very poor credit, often with no down payment, and often with tricky or adjustable terms, were going to start defaulting at higher than predicted rates. And this would obviously have consequences for the people defaulting. The second was that the owner of these mortgages was no longer the original lender. The lenders had bundled the mortgages with other mortgages and sold them off to banks and hedge funds such as the ones at Bear Stearns. The question was whether the problem could be contained. 6 months passed by. The damage from the subprime mortgages turns out to be much worse than anyone ever expected. Throughout this period and the period to come, banks with serious exposure to mortgage-related assets engage in heated debates with investors and critics over the valuation of these assets. Mark-to-market means that companies are supposed to value their assets at their current market price when drawing up from their profit and loss statements. But what if there's no market for these assets? Critics began referring to companies overvaluing their assets as playing mark-to-make-believe. 2007 rolls over into 2008, some indications of the size of the problem come into view. In October, after Merrill Lynch announces that it will be writing down more than $8 billion in subprime and other mortgage-related assets, its chief is forced out. A month later, Bear Stearns, one of the country's largest investment banks, which had taken the most serious initial hit from the subprime CDOs, enters a tailspin from which it will never recover. On Friday, March 14, 2008, after heavy client withdrawals, the bank stands on the brink of bankruptcy. Over the weekend, it is saved at a humiliatingly low price by JP Morgan Chase. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who hold a large portion of the many small and now distressed mortgages, go into conservatorship. The next week, Lehman Brothers, the most exposed of the remaining investment banks, begins to totter, its stock price plunging and its leadership desperately scrambling for some kind of rescue. At this time, Bank of America decides to buy the slightly less troubled Merrill Lynch for a hefty $50 billion. Lehman Brothers files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on September 15th. AIG is not allowed to go under, instead getting nationalized by the Federal Reserve on September 16th for $80 billion. But the crisis is far from over. On September 16th, the Reserve Primary Fund, one of the largest and oldest money market funds, breaks the buck. It turns out to have $800 million of exposure to now worthless Lehman commercial paper. Money market funds face heavy withdrawals and the commercial paper market starts to break down. On the evening of September 18th, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and the Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke meet with congressional leaders to tell them just how bad things are. Paulson and Bernanke present a $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, a bailout package for the banks, explaining that if it is not enacted, the consequences will be dire. On September 21st, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs become bank holding companies overnight, meaning that they will from here on out be regulated by the Fed. A few days later, WaMu is seized by federal regulators and sold off to JP Morgan Chase in the largest bank failure in U.S. history. October 6th through the 10th is the stock market's worst week since the Great Depression. The Dow Jones loses 22% and the S&P 18%. Now here's a chart of some of the largest losers in the large banking world.
And honestly, I'm down like the economy.
Now on to Santos' thesis statements. He has two main questions, and one would be, did the subprime mortgage crisis affect the loan spreads? And given that the crisis affects these loan spreads, is this result caused by the banks, the supply of the loans, or how much the borrowers are demanding from the banks? And a second question is, do banks increase spreads more on their dependent borrowers? The data that Santos used was loan data. It was LPC's deal scan on firms and banks. This data included both private and public firms, but since Santos didn't want to use private firms, he isolated and used only public firms. And the controls were firm, bank, and loan-specific controls.
You can carp all you want about stats and regressions. Econometricians, they're ever so biased. Are they doing real science or confirming their bias?
Now, the variables that Santos used, his dependent variable is the loan spread. And a loan spread is just the difference between the rate charged to customers and the cost of the funds, which is set by LIBOR. His independent variables, he had one which was a dummy variable for crisis time period, and another one for bank difficulties measured by bank charge-offs over loans. Charge-offs are just loans that are no longer considered to be assets. And he found that banks that were weaker charged larger loan spreads. Now, which banks does Santos use? Does he refer to small banks or large banks? In his paper, it's unclear to me, but I'm going just to assume that he refers to large banks. And CEO Chuck Prince, who was the CEO of Citibank during the subprime crisis, when he's reacting to why everyone got sucked into the subprime mortgage crisis, he says, as long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance. And he said, we're still dancing. While not all banks were with him on the dance floor, small banks remained pretty conservative during the crisis, well, at least most did. They usually don't dabble in such complex instruments such as mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. They usually stick to a local customer base and clients that they know. Now, post-crisis, with monetary policy, Bernanke slashed the interest rates, and he initiated 2 rounds of quantitative easing, which increased the liquidity. So my question is, if there was increased liquidity, why weren't banks lending?